Hello, I'm Martha Monson Lowe, and I'm a basket weaver, and I'd like to invite you into my studio. Please come on in. Here we are. I have a whole array of different things in my studio, including my work, and so I can go around and talk about that a little bit. First of all, this is my work table. I can be looking outside, I can watch TV, I've got the fireplace right here, which is my heat in the wintertime. And so this is where my creating begins after I design a variety of different pieces. My father's house we just went through and completed, so I now have a beautiful living room in my studio as well. This corner of my studio is devoted to Palestinian handwork. My husband and I are very involved with peace and justice issues for the Palestinians, and so I have a lot of handwork that I have brought back from our many stays in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. And so along with doing talks, I also have things to offer people for sale. In this corner of my studio, which has just now been covered, I have many pounds of reed or rattan, which is my main material. And so this is what the material looks like when I get it. It's a natural material. It's grown in Southeast Asia. It's a vine. And so this is what it looks like when I get it. In this corner of my studio is where my water source is. And I often soak things outside. Everything has to be wet and pliable while I'm working with it. I also dye my reed for accents. And so I have lots of different colors that I pull when I would like to add color to my baskets. It's a dye called Procyon. It's for natural fibers. And many silk people, or people who are dyeing silk, work with that and use that same dye. So so I do the dyeing, and then my overall dye is walnuts. So now I will start to collect walnuts in the fall, dry them out. They have to be dried for a couple of months at least. And then I soak the walnuts, screen all of that out after about 5 days, and then immerse the whole basket in the walnut dye. So you can see the beautiful rich color that comes with the walnut dye. To me, this is not finished until I dye the piece itself. When I'm dyeing with the Procyon dye that is for my color, my accents, I dye those pieces of reed before I start weaving. Then I weave them into the basket, and then when the basket is completely done, finished woven, then I will dye with my walnut dye, and I will immerse the whole piece into the walnut dye so my colored dyes become more muted and subtle, which is the look that I'm going for. So you can see this particular piece, so the dye is there, the pattern is there, but it's a nice, rich, subtle accent to the piece. A little history of how I got into basket weaving. We were living in Florida, and I decided I would love to take a basket weaving class, which I did at the University of Florida. So that's where my weaving actually started 33 years ago now. And then a few years later, we moved to a place called Holden Village. It's a Lutheran retreat center up in the Cascade Mountains. And I was in charge of their crafts and art studio. So I got into loom weaving as well as basket weaving. Started their basket weaving program there, but I have always been attached to the loom weaving since then, and my loom is ready to be rewarped. But this is one of the pieces that I have done at Holden Village, not on this loom. This is too small for that, but that's when I got heavily into teaching basket weaving, and I taught hundreds and hundreds of people how to do simple baskets. And so that's, I think, when my work really took off, because so many people had questions that pushed me in different directions. And then after we left Holden, I couldn't bear to leave the mountains, and we had moved back to the Midwest. By the way, George and I, both my husband and I, went to Luther College, got degrees. I have a degree in French and anthropology and education. And so anyway, we took off, left for 20 years, and came back to Decorah. But since I couldn't leave the mountains, we bought some property in Washington State. And so that is, that's when I started collecting driftwood. And I love driftwood and I love rocks. And then it evolved into some new pieces that I'll show you. 21 years ago, we bought property, and then we built our beautiful tiny little cabin. It has fantastic views, and so when we were here, I started collecting driftwood up Lake Chelan in Washington, and I'll show you our view of the lake from our cabin. And this is when my work really took off. The view from our cabin is up here, and that's Lake Chelan and the Cascade Mountains. It's a truly inspiring place. And so that's when I began to collect driftwood and put driftwood on my pieces. And so this is one of the results of that. But I love incorporating the driftwood with the pieces themselves. You can see I've put the accent Procyon dyed reed in here, and then woven the piece. Then I put the driftwood on, and then I dye with walnuts. By the way, there is no glue in here. There are no nails or tacks or anything like that. I'll show you some of my tools that I use, but my best tools are my hands. It's much easier to go straight up when you're weaving, but I love focusing on forms and shapes. I don't use any forms, but I love making these curves of the basket, and so many of my pieces have transformed from specifically utilitarian to more decorative, a piece of art rather than just a functional piece. How have we made our living? We have both gone to juried art fairs for the last 25 years, something like that. So my work can be juried into both a fine craft and a fine art show. And I have received awards at both craft and art shows. So it's been a big compliment to my work. I have just a small container of tools that I use, but important tools. These are my reed cutters, and of course I need several. Another tool that I use a lot This is a spoke weight and it's quite heavy. And it's important because when I'm laying reed out and I have 15 pieces across, this will hold everything down while I'm working and working around it. So that's an important tool. Of course, I need to measure with a variety of different things. One thing that I do is I measure, I write down my patterns. And I'll show you my pattern, one of my pattern books. I have about 3 of these that I have created myself. And if you look at it, it's a jumble mess that no one could really figure out. You can see what a great drawer I am. That's about as good as it gets. But for me, if the house was burning, I would grab these before I ran out, because this is very important to me. I can refer back to a pattern. I can say, make notes. This worked, this didn't work, do this instead. But this is what I figure things out. When kids say, "Oh, why do I need to have math?" Well, I've been using it for the last 33 years in my basket weaving. An important thing. So that's my book. Another important tool are my awls. Has to have a point. It gets into these tight spaces where I can't really put my fingers, but I need to get into that little space. I always use it when I am lashing the top of my basket. So as I lash this top together, what I'm doing is I'm sewing the top together, and this is an important tool that I use. Clothespins are, if I had to give everything else up besides my cutting tools, I would want my clothespins. They hold everything together. And many weavers just use them for the first couple of rows. I use them all the way up because you can, as you can see on this piece, again, I love the form, and I need to hold my reed in place, and the change is very subtle. And if I don't have everything held exactly as I want it, I'm not going to be able to achieve this slow curve inward. So that's a very important tool, are the clothespins. Here I have my walnuts. So that's what I use for my dyeing at the end. Of course, pencils, but that's basically my toolkit. So I can actually travel and weave very easily. I weave at my cabin in Washington, and I can just leave a small thing of tools there for me to use. I'd like to show you some other constructions that I do. The last 5 years or so, my husband George, who's a potter, and I have started collaborating with each other. He throws and fires the pot, and then I weave onto it. I had shown you this piece earlier, and when I get the pottery, this is how the piece looks. And if you'll notice, there are little holes on the side. Of course, George has to do that before the pot is fired, before it dries out. And he has to, again, this is math, he has to put a number of holes, specific number of holes. He has to have a multiple of 3 holes minus 1 in order for this pattern to work, to spiral, to zigzag. So in each piece there's a multiple of 3 holes minus 1. So 3 times 7 would be 21, minus 1 would be 20 holes, for example. This piece has many more than that. I'm especially fond of the zigzag. Another of the pieces that we have collaborated on are these vases. Now, on this piece, he has to put 2 sets of holes, the bottom and the top. So when I get the piece and I start planning, I cut pieces that will go from here to here. So from here to here, that when I'm ready to actually weave the piece, I have all of these spokes, they're called spokes, in the piece, and that tension will hold the reed in. Then I start weaving the piece, and you can see this spiral going down, down. I have another construction here, and this piece is similar to this piece of pottery. Starts where there's 1 set of holes. I put the reed through the piece and weave this border around here, and then I start weaving up, and then the last thing I do is weave the border itself. This is basically the same construction as the larger piece, again making that framework, and then as I weave, I'm putting these little eyes, these leaf-like flowing spirals down. So my work is always interesting and changing. I can that's one thing that I really enjoy about it, is I'm not making the same thing over and over again, and each is my own creation, my own design, so I get a lot of enjoyment out of that. I'd like to show you a few specific baskets. This is called my Tunisian Tote. When I was 13, my family moved to Libya, to North Africa, and so we often went to Tunisia. So we had many Tunisian baskets in this shape and style. They were functional. So that's one of my influences. I go to the Amish for my leather handles. So that's one of my pieces. Every piece is unique. Every piece is hand woven. There are no shortcuts to basket weaving. So you can't really produce in mass quantity. Another piece that I really like, the driftwood has come to the bottom of the piece, and it just creates this attitude. So it's a fun piece. It's decorative. You can put dried grasses in it, but it's also a standalone piece. And you see the shape that I'm playing with. So another interesting shape. Besides driftwood, I also incorporate sheds, antlers, into pieces. Sometimes they're handles, sometimes they drop over the front. And every piece, of course, is unique. So the basket has to relate to the shed and the other way around too. Now people ask, how long does that piece take you? It's one of my least favorite questions that I get. And sometimes I say, well, 33 years. This piece took 33 years to weave because that's the experience that I have. And I certainly couldn't have woven these pieces when I first started. Size also doesn't necessarily matter. These two pieces take about the same amount of time as far as the weaving goes. This tiny little miniature it's a twill weave, which is actually the same weave as your denim jeans. So it's fascinating that you can blow it up into a piece like this, and yet it still is a miniature. And of course, then I'm collecting little pieces of driftwood. I've been selling this shape recently to float flowers in the pot. So the ones with pottery, they do hold water. You can have flowers in them. You can see the spiral going down. Again, the multiple of 3 spokes minus 1. I'd like to point out we always date and sign each of our pieces, which eventually that makes it more valuable as well. And the last piece I'd like to show you, you can see George has done the pottery center with many, many holes in it, and then I have woven out and created this flowing piece. I love the movement that is created, the asymmetry that's there, the organic feel to it. Thank you for coming into my studio and seeing my work and listening to my story. And now I'd like to send you over to my husband's pottery, and you can learn more about his work. Thanks for coming.